Though it's not particularly obvious, there is this interesting puzzle that is part of the text I read from the Gospel of Mark this morning. And it's interesting for a number of reasons. One you may not be aware of, and I've got to fit in a little biblical scholarship, so bear with me this morning. The Gospel of Mark was, most scholars believe, the first written gospel. The first gospel written down, and was about 30, 40 years after the death of Jesus. Now, what we probably don't think about is that they didn't have Xerox machines or printing machines back then. So any gospel had to be handwritten, had to be copied and handwritten down, which was done by people in monasteries and churches so that those Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Mark, could be read in different churches. And if you can imagine trying to handwrite out the Gospel, you ought to try it at home maybe, which you can imagine you'd make a few mistakes or might not realize it, but make some kind of minor changes without fully realizing it. What you may not know is that really the first whole manuscript of the Gospels, the oldest manuscript of all the Gospels we have, was only about 400 to 500 years after the birth of Jesus that we have copies of this manuscript, that we have this manuscript. Now, there are small pieces of the Gospel of Mark they have earlier piece, but never the whole part of it until about 400, 500 BC, or 400 or 500 years after the birth of Jesus. What's interesting about the Gospel of Mark is that the oldest manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts we have, chapter 16 ends at verse 8. The text I read. It doesn't have verses 9 through 20. So the earliest record we have of a written record we have of Easter morning, the most interesting puzzle and challenge of it is Jesus doesn't show up. Think about that. That the earliest, in the manuscripts we have, it seems like what happens, most scholars believe, is that became a little scandalous, so some scribe on down the road, decades later, maybe 100 years later, added the last 11 verses to kind of throw Jesus in there because it was just too scandalous that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, come to the tomb, and they don't see the risen Jesus. They are just told he is risen. Think about that. It's almost, and you probably thought this was a mistake in the bulletin, but it was intentional. It's almost as if the Gospel of Mark, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, wanted to leave you with a question mark. Wanted to leave it to you. You hear the Lord is risen. What do you think? Now, what has always also puzzled me about this text is that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome come to the tomb. They go in there and they see this young man in white. It doesn't say he's an angel. It just says a young man in white, and who tells him he is risen. And what is their response to this good news? What is their reaction to this? You think the Lord is risen? I'm going to dance a jig, right? Great news, the songs of joy, hymns. Let's celebrate. And what do they do instead? They are bewildered and trembling in fear. And what's their response to the news, the Lord has risen, what do? It's kind of like Monty Python, King Arthur. They run away, run away. It's like if I said to you, the Lord has risen, and you ran right out the door. That's an odd response to the resurrection if you think about it. What's going on there? There's a book written in 1973 by an anthropologist, a man named Ernest Becker. And Ernest Becker wrote this book, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, using psychology and philosophy. It kind of took academia by storm. That, in fact, the name of the book was called The Denial of Death. And the book he wrote reflected that he says at the heart of our human experience, at the heart of our cultures and communities, he says is this truth: we are the only animal on this planet who knows we're going to die. As far as we know, that's true. That the very experience, the existential experience of being a human being, is this knowledge that we know we are mortal. And he asserts that makes us crazy. In fact, we create cultural symbolic systems to deny death, to push it away, to not have to face that reality. We'll do whatever we can to avoid that truth. Just a pop cultural reference. Actually, that book showed up in Annie Hall. Woody Allen, who's this death-obsessed character, bought a copy of the book for his girlfriend. But his argument is that we run away from death as fast and as quickly as we can. It's not something we can face, and it's the source of our conflicts with each other. It's the source of our dysfunction as human society and culture, is this denial, this fear of death. But there's an interesting facet of the book that doesn't get as much attention, in which he argues if it's not death we're afraid of, really what we're really afraid of is life. Seems an odd thing to say, but he says life is so raw and so beautiful and so wondrous and so amazing and so overwhelming that we can't really embrace it, being alive. Therefore, we hide from it. We preoccupy ourselves. We may deaden ourselves with certain activities or with certain drugs or whatever. We are so not only afraid of death, we're really ultimately afraid of being alive. Truly, truly alive. And I thought about that book when I read this text, and I thought, you know what? They ran away because they were afraid of life. New kind of life. And the possibility of life. They were ready to embrace death, but no, what they found, what frightened them so much, is that there was life where they expected death. Now that may sound strange to our ears, but the truth is, we live that now, don't we? We live, and it's hard for us to believe or trust life in the midst of sometimes a culture that seems preoccupied with death. Children are gunned down in a school by another fellow student. Young black men shot because they're holding cell phones. Dysfunction in our system. Things seem to be falling apart. Death seems to reign, right? And it makes us afraid. But I think really what this story tells us, what we need to reflect on, it's not death we're so as much afraid of as the truth to believe that life, being alive, can truly exist in this world, even amidst those tombs. Good news of Easter is that in a world filled with injustice and oppression and brokenness and hate and cruelty, which just seems to always be around us, God asserted in Jesus, life wins. And the truth be told, I think that scares us more than a little. Do you really believe that? So it's been about 1.5 years since my mother passed away. That was a difficult time in my life, my family's life. My mother had battled cancer for many, many years, and I do not regret those last weeks I had with her as she faded. I do not regret and was not frightened by that time with her. It was a time of sorrow and grief and a very difficult time. Someone I loved very deeply. But if I regret anything, if I'm truly honest, if I regret anything, is I didn't take the time sometimes to really be alive with her. To really appreciate just holding her hand. Or listening to her voice talk about something small and minor. If I regret anything, it's that I was truly afraid of being alive to her and to those around me. Hallelujah, the Lord is risen. He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.